Hey, welcome to the show. We are excited for this one. We are going to do in this podcast right here, this show, we are going to do a entire book of the Bible. So buckle up, children.
Buckle up. It's gonna be a good one.
Put her in drive. We're going through, on layman's term, right here today, we're going through Philemon or Philemon.
I think it's Philemon. Because it's like
I think
Phil.
I think it's Philemon too.
Philemon. And then you just gotta say it really fast.
Philemon.
We're just gonna go with
Yeah, Philemon would be like my Missouri way of saying it.
Philemon. That's fancy.
Philemon.
All
right.
We're going with Philemon.
We're going with Philemon. And then, so if you're familiar with the book of Philemon.
Can I say something first?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I mean, the sands of time are falling.
Yeah. So one of my pet peeves, right, is when you're having a conversation with somebody and it turns into, like maybe you're talking to somebody that doesn't really believe, right? It's kind of skeptical, right? And they always point to things in the New Testament, maybe in the traditional four gospels around Jesus' time, right, or whatever. And they're always like, well, Jesus never said slavery was bad. So, like Jesus would talk about slaves and this and that and this and that. So he must have condoned slavery, right?
Oh.
And because he condoned slavery, then the whole thing is, bunk, right, or whatever. But see, this, you can tell that people haven't really read or understand the entire scripture, right? Because Philemon is like the antithesis. Like that's the argument. Like this is the book that basically Paul writes, and even though Paul doesn't say slavery is evil and horrible, he basically does it without saying it, right? And so like this is like well, you've never read Philemon before, have you? And then you just walk away. Because chances are either they're going to immediately go read it or they're just going to carry on with their thought anyways, and they don't really care what you have to say. So you don't really get in an argument with them. Anyway, so that's just my... You and
I argue all the time, and I care what you have to say.
Yeah, but most of the time when random people argue with you about slavery in the Bible, they don't really care what you have to say, right? They just have their own opinion. Anyway, it's just a pet peeve. About once a year it happens, to me personally.
Really?
Yep.
Well, you're an argumentative kind of guy, though.
I'm not really an argumentative kind of guy. I just come off that way.
Oh. So people like, oh, this guy's picking a fight.
I can pick a fight with this guy. Anyway, so you were saying you were going to give a background. If you haven't read Philemon.
It's the entire book. If you've never read a book of the Bible, and you're an achiever, knock this one out. It's one page on mine.
Two in mine.
On the one Keith has right here, I have the itty bitty.
But there's like a big introduction.
Introduction.
I believe it's the shortest book in the Bible. I believe it is.
It's pretty short.
Yeah. So this is a great, if you've never done a small group Bible, like a Bible study, and you're kind of nervous about it, and then you see one on Philemon, chances are it's like 2 days. This is the easiest small group to do. Yeah. So
what we have here, we'll break it down real quick. We have Philemon is a buddy of Paul.
Yep.
All right. Paul is writing to Philemon from prison.
Mm-hmm.
Other stuff Paul wrote from prison is like letter to the Ephesians, letter to the Colossians. What other stuff he write while he was in prison?
A bunch of stuff.
So, Philippians. So, anyway.
Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians.
Perfect. So, he's writing from prison to a friend because, small world, right? Like, I'm sure they said... So Philemon right? That's how we're saying it?
Yeah. I don't know. Philemon.
Philemon.
Well, we're just going to say it, whatever.
All right. So Philemon has this, has a slave.
He probably has more than one.
Probably.
You could probably venture. But he steals money. The slave steals money.
Onesimus.
Onesimus is the name of the slave who steals
Onesimus.
some money from Philemon and then runs away.
Well, then, once again, small world
Small world.
becomes friends with Paul in prison. Now, I don't know how you become friends with somebody in prison when you're not in prison.
Well, yeah, I would assume that. Think of like prisons today, and this is like totally like anecdotal because
Completely made up.
you have visitors. You go visit somebody, right? So I would assume a couple things. I would assume one, the guards were probably Roman soldiers, and they probably didn't cook the food. Yeah, it probably wasn't great food anyways. They didn't cook the food and clean out the prison cell toilet, because there's probably not showers and, toilets and stuff like that, right? I mean, this is like first century. So I'm sure they had workers that worked in the prison or in the jail.
All right.
Right.
A lot of assumptions happening here on the show today.
Yep.
So we've made a bunch of
Historians are throwing things at the walls.
Earbuds are flying. So we've made our assumptions, but regardless of how it happens, Paul befriends Onesimus, and Onesimus relays the story. Like, hey, what's your story? How'd you get here, right? And
yeah.
He fills Paul in, and Paul's like, oh, dude,
I know that guy.
I know that guy.
Santa.
I know that guy. He's a good dude.
He's a dude good. He's like my brother.
Yeah, I love that guy.
Yeah.
He's a Christian. I'm a Christian. See what's happening
See what's
here?
going on? Well, yeah. So seems like at some point Paul converts Onesimus to Christianity,
or solidifies
his faith in Christianity. So now he's a brother in Christ, and Paul sends. But he doesn't actually send him back first. He writes the letter first.
Writes the letter to send with him.
To send with Onesimus back to Philemon, and in very amazing way tells him to not treat him as a slave, but treat him as a brother, and embrace him, because Onesimus is dear to Paul, and therefore Philemon should respect him right at that point.
Yeah, this is like really
and forgive him of his debts and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and this is like really good, like crucial conversation stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like Paul he's really good here. He opens up. He's pleading to the virtues of Philemon, telling him how good of a dude he is, and then letting him know, well, because you're a wonderful, loving, kind person following Christ, I need you to now act like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, live it out. Like,
actually live.
Here's where
practice what you preach.
Here's where the rubber meets the road, buddy. Because the dude that brought you the letter back is your runaway slave thief who stole from you.
And we don't know how much, but we could assume that it's a significant amount if it's mentioned.
That's true.
Right. So, yeah. This is tough, I think, because if you know much about Roman time in the early AD, if you had a slave who ran away and you got them back somehow, you could do whatever you wanted as punishment, up to and including execution, right? So, and often slaves
and you just turn them over? You just turn them over to the... I mean, I don't...
Well, let's say you had, 100 slaves and one ran away, you want to set an example for the other slaves not to run away, right?
Okay.
So, it's Rome was not a great place to be in the early ADs. That's for sure. So,
And an even worse place to be a slave.
an even worse place to be a slave. And if you think, if you know much about slavery in the early days too, it wasn't just our idea of slavery where somebody goes to another country, captures people, brings them back, and says you're slaves now, right? But there were people that were not born a slave, were born into a family and sold themselves into slavery for even not necessarily a lifetime, but a specific number of years, to pay off a debt or pay off a family debt or to help. So this is like a very common occurrence. There's all different levels of, I don't want to say levels of slaves, but there's all different ways that you could get kind of brought into slavery, other than being forced. Like some of it's not forced slavery. Some of it is, in terms of debts and stuff. But
yeah, and I imagine too the way of all debts and credits is it's a rigged system, though.
Yeah. Oh, it's completely a rigged system. Yeah. You kind of, and
once you're in, you're probably not out.
Yeah, and I don't want to get this. I don't want to get this wrong.
Because we haven't made any assumptions so far.
No, yeah, we haven't made any assumptions. But I was reading this story, and I can't remember. It was an Asian country. I want to say it was China. It may not be China. It may be a different country. But where the factory workers like lived at the factory and they worked 18 hours a day, and the wages that they got, they had to pay for the room at the factory. They had to pay for food at the factory. They had to pay for using the bathroom. The factory had a convenience store in it for all their daily needs. And it was basically like modern slavery because they work, they make a paycheck to basically pay for the things they needed that day. And there wasn't much wiggle room left over to work for a couple of years, save a bunch of money, and then go buy a house or something, right? So,
the old banjo picking song, 16 Ton.
No, I don't.
Tennessee Ernie Ford. Owe my soul to the company store.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Kind of same. Yeah. Wasn't that the Great Depression?
It's just coal mining.
Coal. Yeah. The company store, right? Like that. It's an old. It's an old trick. So I would assume a lot of that's probably pretty similar, right?
It was rooted in history.
I'm sure it was. Anyway, so what I find interesting, I think the most about this is, to your point, you kind of said it really, really, really quick. But there comes a time in our life where we have to practice what we preach.
Yep.
Right? Where we have to, whatever it is, spiritually, financially, right? Whatever. We walk around quite a bit talking about the way things should be, but we really, do we often do it?
Yep. And I think the cool part about this is this super short letter written, and there's 3 characters.
Yeah.
There's some other names mentioned, but there's 3 characters, right? There's Paul, who can't make Philemon do anything.
Yeah.
Right? You can't force his hand. He can't make him do anything. He's like the coach, right?
Yeah.
He's not in the game.
Yeah.
He's on the sideline. He's in prison. And then you have Philemon, who is in a great position, I presume. He's leading in ministry. He has it in they're meeting in his home, I think we read in here. And he's of this wealth and stature to have subordinates.
Right. And money to steal.
And money for someone to steal.
Right.
So by all accounts, I think he's doing all right, and probably not the first knee-jerk reaction would be to listen to the guy who got himself locked up.
Yeah.
Right.
But he is also Paul.
Exactly.
Right?
So we have these three characters in the story, and we can all find ourselves. And then you have Onesimus, who is just at the mercy of all parties involved.
Yeah.
So it's really cool. This super short story, we can all find ourselves in one or more of those positions in relationships all throughout our Christian life, Christian maturity.
You have somebody that needs forgiveness, somebody that can offer the forgiveness, the only person that can offer the forgiveness for the act, and then the bystander that's saying
The conscience,
the advisor, saying you should forgive them.
Yeah. So it's something we can definitely learn here from each party involved, depending on what our current state or situation is. I think, you can often find yourself in conversations with folks where we've talked about this before, where we kind of write our own, story. We write our own how we want to spin things, right? And you can often find yourself in a position in conversation where you have an opportunity to go along with someone's story they're telling themselves, right? Their own narrative that they're just repeating until they remember it, or you can appeal, as Paul does, out of love to get them to be a little more introspective and help bring some resolution or the best or the best out of someone. So I think that's what Paul does. Philemon gets we assume he's receptive to Paul's leadership.
I mean, we would assume that Philemon did what Paul requested. Otherwise, they may not have put the letter in the Bible. Right?
Well, how would the letter have gotten here, right?
I know. I'm just saying. I find this method interesting because had Paul and Philemon been in person, how would the conversation have been different? Right? Versus in a letter. Okay. Now, I can imagine in person there might be a little back and forth. Like, hey, this is my friend. Oh, that's the guy that stole money from me. Right? Like,
yeah.
Hey, look, he's my friend though, and we're friends, and you should probably, forgive him of that. Well, no way, that was a lot of money, man.
Yeah, he didn't steal from you, he stole from me.
He stole from me, right? Like, and so by having it in a letter written, you can't really argue. You can just, you write another letter and send Onesimus back to Paul, go back to Paul and give him this letter, So it gives Philemon a chance to kind of process, I think, what the ask is, and probably those emotions, because you gotta imagine if somebody, if you had a housekeeper or somebody like a pest control guy, right, come in your house, and so you've known him for 20 years, the next thing you know, your wallet's missing, right? You'd probably be pretty upset with that, and then the pest control guy comes back and says, "Oh man, I'm sorry, I stole your wallet." You'd probably still be pretty mad, So that's a normal human emotion, and I think that anybody in this situation, and think about Onesimus coming back.
He didn't even have to come back. Paul gives him the letter. He could be like, "Right, I'm going to Greece."
You know what I'm saying? Like the faith, I guess, in Onesimus, the trust and faith, and to go back and like, it's not even really like, hey, Onesimus says he's sorry and I believe him, right? That's like not in there. It's just, hey, we know this happened, and I mean, Paul does say, look, I'll pay you back if you really want the money. I'll pay you back, like you, and it's me, buddy. You know I'm
if
good
that's
for
what
it.
it's about.
If that's what it's about the money. I'll whatever he owes you, I'll pay for it, right? So yeah, I mean, it's just like that trust that Onesimus has to go back to this guy that used to be his, master or whatever, and be like, Paul says we're brothers now. Come on, give me a big hug,
Yeah.
bro. Like that's incredible to me, I guess.
And I think that's the from that aspect of Christian maturity, of recognizing fellow Christians on that same level, with that peer to peer mutual respect, not thinking, oh, well, I've been a Christian my whole life, and here comes this new guy with different ideas. Like, no, man, you're equally sinners and in need of salvation and redemption, and like, it's humbling.
Yeah,
I think there's a large humbling aspect to being the Philemon in this story, and there's a salvation story in being Onesimus, in being trusting the salvation promised to you, trusting in the promised love of Christ and his believers. So there's a faith story, there's a salvation story, there's trust being lived out, there's humility being experienced, and there's a tremendous amount of faith and admonishment and encouragement of Christian accountability being lived out. So it's an action-packed book.
letter, single page.
Single page, go read it, start to finish.
You could print off a copy of it and keep it in your pocket.
There's enough sands of time left here. I could read you the whole thing.
Well, here's what I want to do. I want to ask you a question. In life, based off of this story,
Okay.
do you find yourself more of the Philemon character who is having to forgive even though he maybe doesn't want to? Do you find yourself more of the Onesimus character who is trepidatiously, potentially, asking somebody for forgiveness, right? And then not being ashamed of it, because now they're all brothers in Christ. They're all great, they're all great people now. Now you have to even be not ashamed of what you did around this person anymore, right? Or do you find yourself more of the Paul who is the advisor, but is also the very trusted advisor who is practicing what he's preaching, right? Is the example. Where do you find yourself on the spectrum more often than not?
Well, that's what I think is great about this story, because in all different life stages, ages, situations, you can experience all three of the characters, right?
Sure.
But coming back to where we always seem to end up and land on the show is, I have kids, you have kids. And from a parenting perspective, when you have kids, small children, kids in the home, middle schoolers, I think if the majority of your time you're not having to be the Paul,
yeah,
I imagine the majority of the time I'm in Paul mode. Right?
You're in Paul mode.
Well, you're encouraging, they're dealing with friendships, they're dealing with relationships, they're in the home, so at school, in life, sports teams. So if you're, I feel like it's always encouraging Christian brotherhood, faith, forgiveness, encouraging that forgiveness, because it's not good for you personally to hold on to the grudge. Just in and of itself, you have to release that. And then it's not good for the relationship with this fellow person, right? Like, it's like a work environment or a school environment. To have a grudge or an unresolved dispute, or it's unhealthy for it to remain unresolved. So anyway, appealing to the goodness that's within all of us, as Paul so thoroughly and expertly does here, is a great example of coaching not only your kids through their relationships, but introspectively helping yourself through your own relationships.
Yeah.
So I think current lifetime, current life age and stage, and given the current happenings, I think it's a Paul moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I can see probably in my youth, I was more of the Onesimus character.
For sure.
Right. And then you kind of reach a level of...
I needed help getting my foot out of my mouth quite often.
I mean, I still need help for that sometimes. But yeah, you kind of get to a point, I think, in personal development where you hopefully transition out of that, right? And unfortunately, there's, I think, some people that we all know that can't transition out of that, needing forgiveness. Not that we all don't need forgiveness for things, but anyway, yeah, I think that's interesting. So, yeah, I mean, it's a good read. It only takes like 5 minutes to read it, but it's hours of
read it in the morning,
process,
chew on it all day.
Yeah.
So, hey, with the shortest book in the Bible, shortest letter in the Bible, we are going to wrap this episode before our sands of time run out. So thanks for joining us, and
we'll see you next week.
See you next week.